The dessert was sweet, the ending not so much. Someone didn't survive the final course. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your comments make each tale even richer. Here we go. It was a Thursday, which meant three things. Fritz had planned trout amandine for dinner. I was due for a haircut at 3:30 with Lewis down on 10th, and Nero Wolfe wasn't planning to leave the brownstone under threat of fire, flood, or FBI raid. By 10 that morning, two of those assumptions were already in danger. The trout was still on track, bless Fritz's impeccable Gallic sense of schedule, but the haircut was off the table. That was thanks to the unexpected arrival of a woman who looked like she'd just walked out of a Bergdorf window and brought her perfume cloud with her. She rang the bell at 9:48. I remember because I was debating whether to open the Gazette or go back upstairs and see if I could get Wolfe to finally sign off on the latest invoices. Instead, I opened the door to find a tall blonde in deep navy silk, wearing a hat that could have doubled as a boat sail and an expression that said she was either very rich or very used to pretending she was. Her gloves were off, literally, and clutched in her right hand with a small silver clutch that probably cost more than my month's salary. "Mr. Wolfe?" she asked. I gave her the smile I reserve for people who bypass introductions. "One floor up and 30 stone of stubborn between you and him. I'm Archie Goodwin." That earned me a flicker of something behind her eyes. "Miss Claudia Durney, I have an appointment." I hadn't made one, neither had Wolfe. I stepped aside anyway. It was one of those mornings when curiosity outweighed protocol, and besides, she didn't look like someone who dropped by to complain about a neighbor's barking dog. She moved through the hallway like she was inspecting it, not entering it, and when I led her up to the office, I could already feel Wolfe's eyebrows loading for launch. He was in his chair, naturally. Yellow pajamas under a brown robe, legs crossed, glass of beer on the side table, eyes scanning a page of the Orchid Grower's Journal like it held the answer to world peace. When I cleared my throat, he looked up. When he saw Claudia Durney, he didn't rise, but his interest ticked up half a notch. "I wasn't expecting a client," he said without warmth. "You weren't expecting me," she replied, lowering herself into the red chair as if she owned it and half the block. That got him. Wolfe hates being surprised almost as much as he hates physical exertion. His eyes narrowed a millimeter. "Miss Durney, was it?" "Yes, Claudia Durney. I brought dessert to a dinner party last night, and someone there died after eating it." That line could have come from a too-real melodrama. Wolfe didn't flinch, but I leaned forward a little in my chair. She continued, "I didn't poison anyone, Mr. Wolfe. But this morning, a Detective Rowcliffe with a smug mustache and no sense of timing rang my bell and asked how much nutmeg I'd put in my pear tart. He said one of the guests, Tad Kellum, collapsed after dessert. He died before the ambulance arrived." I looked at Wolfe. He was very still, which granted is not rare, but this was the particularly still stillness that meant he was focusing. She said tart, nutmeg, and dead in the same sentence. That gets his attention. "I brought the dessert," she went on, "but I didn't make it. It was from a caterer in Soho. I picked it up on the way, but now they're asking if I argued with Tad. I did, but not about anything important. And I want someone to help before the story becomes something it isn't." Wolfe spoke without moving his head. "What was the occasion?" "A private dinner, 7 people. Not a restaurant, not a benefit. A thank-you gathering of sorts. It was held at the apartment of Simon Berridge, the restaurateur. I'd heard of him. Berridge owned Lode, that swanky nightmare of polished concrete and waiters who spoke like sommeliers with secrets." Wolfe grunted. "You were acquainted with the deceased?" "More than acquainted." She crossed her legs and rested a manicured hand on the armrest. "Tad was my ex-fiancé." "Of course he was." "And why?" Wolfe asked slowly. Did you bring the dessert if the dinner was hosted by a restaurateur? Because Simon asked me to. It was a joke, an old joke between Tad and me. He used to claim I couldn't bake to save my life. So Simon thought it would be amusing if I brought something sweet to end the meal. That's not amusing, Wolfe said flatly. No, she agreed, and for the first time, she looked tired. It's not. Wolfe closed the journal and shifted in his chair, an earthquake in Wolfian terms. You said 7 people? Yes. Simon Berridge, me, Tad Kellum, Phaedra Lee, the art dealer, her partner, Paul King. There was also Chef Ludo March from Simon's restaurant and one of Tad's new clients, a woman named Celine Otterbridge. That made 7, and at least 3 of them had names that sounded like they'd stepped out of a noir playbill. Wolfe said, "You were lovers." You argued. You brought the final course. Mr. Kellum is dead, and now you are here. I came because you're better than the police, and because if I don't get ahead of this, I'll be the next course on someone's plate. Wolfe frowned. Your idiom is distasteful. Claudia met his gaze without blinking. So is being accused of murder. There was silence. Wolfe looked at her. She looked back. Finally, he said, Archie, bring me her address, the names of all attendees, and the contact for the caterer. Then call Saul Panzer. I want eyes on the restaurant before it closes. I blinked. That meant he was in. And the fee? Claudia asked. Wolfe closed his eyes. Mr. Goodwin will arrange the particulars. I do not yet know if I'm solving a crime or untangling foolishness. That was Wolfe's way of saying the hook had caught, but he didn't yet know what he was reeling in. I stood, scribbled a note to Fritz that lunch might be delayed, and started toward the door. I had names to track, a death after dessert to unpack, and a caterer in Soho who might have mixed more than nutmeg into a tart. But mostly, I had the familiar itch of a mystery slipping into place, and Nero Wolfe had just cleared his desk. That meant someone was lying, and we were about to find out who. By the time I had Claudia Durney's neat, perfumed list of the 6 other dinner guests in my pocket and her caterer's card tucked beside it, Fritz was peering at me from the dining room with the look of a man who knew the trout Amandine was about to suffer a dishonorable delay. I gave him a nod that said, "Not my fault, Fritz. Blame dessert," and headed for the hall phone to call Saul. I didn't need to explain much. Just the name load, the chef involved, and the basic outline. Saul doesn't ask why anymore. He just said, "All right, I'll walk by and do the usual," and hung up. If Saul Panzer ever decides to become a philosopher, the Stoics would welcome him with a chair and a cigar. Back upstairs, Wolfe was already motionless again, but his eyes followed me when I entered. That was rare. He was thinking, which meant I'd better not interrupt him with anything less than useful. "Panzer's on it," I said. "He'll swing by Loder, see what's cooking besides duck confit. I'll head to the caterer." Wolfe gave a slight nod. "Good. Ascertain who prepared the tart. Request a list of ingredients. Bring back a sample if one remains. And if they look at me like I'm asking for King Tut's teeth," he sipped his beer, "then offer them money. Your discretion, not my purse." I saluted with 2 fingers and left. It was a 20-minute cab to Soho, plus 10 more because the driver had strong feelings about the sanitation commissioner and needed to monologue about them while missing 3 turns. I eventually landed in front of a narrow storefront with frosted glass and lettering that said Petite Flamme Catering. Seasonal, ethical, divine. Inside, it smelled like rosemary and rent pressure. There were white-tiled counters, handwritten chalk menus, and a woman at the register who looked like she taught Pilates between soufflés. I gave her my best smile, slid Claudia's name across the counter like a poker chip, and watched her expression turn from polite to wary. "Claudia Durney," she repeated, glancing at the name like it might rub off on her fingertips. "Yes, she picked up 2 pear and nutmeg tarts yesterday morning. 12-inch almond crust. Gluten-free. Made here? Yes. By. A pause. Chef Marius. He handles pastry. Would you like to speak with him? Very much, but if he's sensitive, tell him I'm from the Department of Fig-related Crimes. She didn't laugh, so I kept it moving. Chef Marius turned out to be a tall, tired-looking guy with skin like steamed milk and forearms like rolling pins. He wore his apron like it had been ironed into him. I heard, he said before I even asked, about Kellum. The woman called, not her, the other one, Phaedra. I took out my notepad. She said what? She said there'd been a death, asked about what was in the tart. I told her, pears, nutmeg, almond flour, honey, butter, eggs, no dairy, no additives. We're careful here. Any chance anything got swapped, contaminated, spiced up by mistake? He shook his head slowly. I run a clean kitchen, and I make all the tarts myself. Nutmegs from Grenada, shipped dry and ground here. We refrigerate everything within 30 minutes of prep. I asked him for a sample of the same tart, and after a short consultation with the Pilates receptionist, he brought me a half-tart in a box like it was a holy relic. As I stepped back onto the street, my phone buzzed. It was Saul. Lode's kitchen's locked tighter than a vault, he said. But here's the fun part. There's a side entrance from the alley. Someone left a fresh cigarette butt back there. Lucky strikes. I took a photo and checked the trash. It was dumped early this morning. Clean. Whatever happened in there last night, it didn't leave much residue. What about Chef Ludo? Already asked a guy who knows a guy. The chef's been having problems. Pressured to sell a recipe line to a frozen food chain. Rumor is he's been grumpy about it. And the guy who kept pushing him? Let me guess. Tad Kellum. He invested in Lode 6 months ago. That gave me something to chew on besides pastry. Thanks, Saul. Keep looking. If the tart wasn't poisoned at the caterer, someone doctored it at the dinner or after it was plated. I hung up and caught a cab back uptown, 1 tart richer and 10 questions heavier. Wolfe was in his chair when I returned, naturally. He didn't look up as I placed the box on his desk. He did, however, raise an eyebrow when I gave the rundown. No evidence of negligence, I finished. Chef Marius swears he did everything clean. Saul says the alley behind Lode saw some traffic late last night. Tad was pushing Chef Ludo into some frozen deal. Oh, and Phaedra Lee called the caterer before we did. Wolfe leaned back slightly, tenting his fingers. Curious. You think she was trying to get ahead of it? He sighed. No, Mr. Goodwin. I think she was trying to manage what she thought she knew. He tapped the armrest twice, then rang for Fritz. When Fritz entered, Wolfe gestured to the tart. Prepare a quarter slice from the center, warmed slightly, nothing added. Bring it here with a clean fork. Fritz didn't blink. He nodded and carried it out like he was handling uranium. I sat. You want to taste it? Certainly not. You will. I stared at him. You do realize that if there was poison, I'd be doing the cha-cha in a pine box by sundown. Don't be melodramatic. Claudia Durney and 6 others consumed it. Only 1 perished. If it had been laced pre-bake, others would be ill. If it were a targeted dose, it would have been applied after slicing. So this is a test. A taste, Mr. Goodwin. Not an autopsy. Fritz returned with the tart, still warm. I took the fork. The crust was delicate, the filling soft and fragrant. I took a bite. No bitterness, no off notes, just pear, nutmeg, and something subtle underneath, a whisper of almond. It's good, I said. Not worth dying for. That will suffice, Wolfe replied. Now call Miss Durney. I require all dinner attendees here tomorrow at 11 o'clock, no exceptions. She won't like that. I care not. Someone served death after dessert. It is time to ask what else was on the table. I made the call, and as I listened to Claudia's voice on the other end, clipped, breathless, not quite surprised, I realized Wolfe had already narrowed his net. Now, We were baiting the hook. The next morning, at precisely 10:53 a.m., the brownstone had that rare air of a public performance being set for a private audience. Fritz had made the rounds with coffee, black for the men, cream for the women unless otherwise instructed, and Wolfe had adjusted his chair forward by exactly 3 inches. That, for the uninitiated, meant he was in no mood for digressions. His robe was brown, his shirt white, and his patience, I guessed, about medium rare. By 11 o'clock sharp, the guests began arriving. Claudia was first, in a grey suit with faint pinstripes and a face that said she hadn't slept and didn't intend to admit it. Right behind her came Simon Berridge, the restaurateur, with the look of a man who preferred to be dealing with truffles instead of people. He had dark eyes, slicked back hair, and a tan that was either natural or fantastically well-funded. Phaedra Lee showed up third, trailed by her partner, Paul King, both wrapped in matching scarves like they were trying to merge into a single aesthetic. Phaedra had those calculating eyes that flicked over everything twice. Paul had a jawline that looked like it had been approved by a committee. Chef Ludo March came next. Big man, coat slightly too tight across the shoulders, expression set in the permanent snarl of someone who'd rather be in front of a flame than a detective. And last, 5 minutes late and unapologetic, was Celine Otterbridge. She had on too much jewelry, too much scent, and a purse that looked like it could double as a murder weapon. I guided them, one by one, into Wolfe's office. Claudia took the red chair again without asking. Phaedra and Paul took the couch. Simon lingered by the bookcase, while Ludo settled on the edge of a yellow armchair as if unsure if it would support him. Celine remained standing, arms folded, eyes sharp and amused. I stood just behind Wolfe's desk, notebook in hand, pen ready, tension simmering. Wolfe let the silence sit just long enough to register with each of them. "I've asked you here," he said finally, voice as smooth and heavy as syrup, "to resolve the death of Mr. Tad Kellum. You are not suspects. You are participants in an incident that remains, delicately, unresolved." Simon cleared his throat. "I've spoken to the police. They said nothing is confirmed yet. Tad had a heart condition." "Yes," Wolfe said. "So I am told. Mild, managed, and of insufficient severity to explain acute fatality without external cause. No autopsy has yet been released." "Then why summon us?" Celine asked, arms still folded. "There's no murder, then there's no mystery." "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "there is both. Mr. Goodwin has investigated the source of the dessert. I find no fault there. That leads us to the point of consumption." Ludo grunted. "You think someone added something? At the table?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that someone took advantage of a moment, an opportunity too convenient to resist." Paul shifted. Why would anyone want Tad dead? Claudia, to her credit, didn't flinch. She looked at Wolfe. "May I?" Wolfe nodded once. "Tad wasn't easy," she said. "He could be charming, funny, persuasive, but he was also vindictive when crossed. He left people behind when they weren't useful anymore, sometimes loudly." Simon smiled tightly. "That's putting it mildly." "And yet," Wolfe said, "you dined with him." "People dine with enemies all the time," Phaedra said. "It was meant to be a reunion, closure of sorts." "For whom?" Wolfe asked. Silence. Then Phaedra answered, her voice cooler. "For Claudia. For Tad. For all of us. We'd all had business with him at one time. We'd all been burned a little." Paul nodded. Tad liked to make deals, but he was always the one walking away with the better end. He left Simon out of the load expansion, even though he promised a partnership. He sold one of Phaedra's artists to another gallery at a discount, just to spite her, and he tried to pressure Chef March into turning his creations into freezer food. "You forgot me," Celine said, eyes glinting. "He borrowed money. He offered stakes in some business venture that didn't exist, promised to pay me back with interest. I've seen about a third of it. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. So, 6 people, 6 motives, varied but aligned. What I require now is your full account of the evening, who sat where, what was served, and what occurred during the dessert course. That got them squirming. I flipped to a fresh page in my notebook. This part was my job. Simon spoke first. The table seated 8. Claudia brought the tarts in a box. I plated them in the kitchen myself. 1 slice each. I carried them out. Ludo poured dessert wine. Who sat next to Mr. Kellum? Wolfe asked. Me, Claudia said. On his right. Celine on his left. Who ate first? I think Ludo did, Paul offered. He never waits. Ludo scowled. I don't recall, it's dessert. I wasn't watching. And who finished first? Wolfe asked. Simon again. Tad. He devoured it. Was there anything unusual about his behavior? Wolfe asked. A long pause. Then Celine said, he laughed. Loudly. Right after he finished. Then he coughed. We thought he was choking. Then he went quiet. Was his glass touched after that? No, Claudia said. He didn't drink more. He slumped in his chair. I thought he was joking. He wasn't, Phaedra said quietly. I glanced at Wolfe. His face was unreadable, but I could see it happening, like a machine absorbing data, discarding the chaff, assembling something invisible to the rest of us. He sat forward. One more question. Did any of you notice anyone leave the table before the dessert? They looked at each other. Ludo went to the kitchen, Claudia said slowly, to check on the wine. I did, he admitted. Briefly. 10 seconds. Did you return carrying anything? Wolfe asked. Nothing. What about before that? Wolfe pressed. Was anyone near the dessert before it was plated? Simon exhaled. The tarts were in the kitchen. Covered. I went in once to grab the cheese course. Claudia followed me in. We were talking. Wolfe's gaze shifted. Miss Durney? Yes. I followed him in. For what purpose? I was making sure he didn't botch the slicing, she said, half smiling. It was my tart. Did you touch it? She looked Wolfe dead in the eye. No. Did he? No, she said again. He used gloves and a steel slicer, 1 plate at a time. That was enough for Wolfe. For now. He nodded at me. Thank you all, I said, standing. You'll be contacted if we need further statements. Please leave contact details with me before you go. They left one by one. Phaedra and Paul exited quickly, whispering. Ludo didn't speak. Celine dropped her card into my hand with a wink I could have done without. Simon and Claudia lingered. When the room was empty again, Wolfe let out a long, measured breath. Well? I asked. He didn't open his eyes. Someone lied, Mr. Goodwin. I do not yet know who, but someone handled those tarts between kitchen and table. And whoever it was knew precisely what they were doing. You will go to load, reconstruct the scene, look for a place where one might doctor 6 plates under the guise of plating them. I nodded. And if I find it? Then we bait a second dessert. It was close to 3 when I arrived at load, and the restaurant was between lunch and dinner, half lit, half staffed, and half ready for anything. The host at the door recognized my name, but not my purpose, which suited me fine. I gave him Wolfe's card, told him we'd been retained to clarify an incident, and requested access to the dining room and kitchen. 5 minutes later, a wiry assistant manager with nervous energy and coffee breath brought me in through the side. The main dining area was an exercise in curated elegance, shadowy wood, low lighting, tables spaced like they belonged to different social classes. I scanned it quickly, but didn't pause. I needed the kitchen. It was a long galley-style space, narrow but efficient, with stainless steel counters, hanging pots, and an oven that looked like it could roast a wild boar or launch a space capsule. The plating station was toward the far end, past the main line and beneath a large industrial lamp. That's where the dessert had been sliced and served. "Simon Berridge plated here?" I asked. The assistant manager nodded. "Yes. Last night he was proud of it. Said he wanted to personally finish the performance." I stepped around the counter and studied the layout. Directly opposite the prep table was a stack of white dessert plates, clean, glossy, identical. A narrow drawer held the standard silver slicer Claudia had described. Long blade, hollow edge, still faintly scented with almond and citrus. There were 6 plates missing from the top stack. I found them drying by the sink. I stared at the row of square porcelain and tried to imagine the choreography. Simon in the kitchen, Claudia trailing him, 2 tarts, 1 blade. One fatal result. I bent low and looked beneath the counter. Nothing unusual, just a towel rack, bins for refuse, a cabinet with sealed spices and a backup cutting board. But when I opened the bottom drawer, something caught my eye. A small, waxy packet wedged behind the edge of the drawer liner. I slid it out with 2 fingers. It was empty. Pale yellow on the inside, the faint trace of powder dust still clinging to the corners. No label, no brand. It looked like it could have once held a supplement or a rare spice or something with far less culinary aspirations. I pocketed it carefully. When I turned back, the assistant was watching me. "I'll need a copy of the service schedule from last night," I said. "Anyone who entered this kitchen from 7 to 10. He hesitated. "The owner might not like." "Then tell him to take it up with Mr. Wolfe. If you've ever heard of him, you know he eats interference for breakfast." That earned me a clipped nod, and while he went to find the logs, I stepped back into the dining room. I stood where Claudia might have sat. Then where Simon stood as he emerged from the kitchen with the plates. Then finally, I stood where Tad Kellum would have been, dessert fork in hand, half laughing, and then not breathing. Something didn't line up. If Simon plated the dishes alone and Claudia only followed him in briefly, when did the tampering happen? Someone had doctored 1 slice, Kellum's, but the tarts were whole when Simon entered the kitchen. That meant someone had to know in advance which slice Tad would get, or they controlled who got which slice. That meant intent, planning, precision. It meant this wasn't spontaneous. It meant the killer either plated it themselves or directed the plates in such a way that Kellum's was always going to reach him. I was still turning it over when my phone buzzed. "Wolfe?" "Yes." "What did you find?" "An empty powder packet behind the prep drawer. No label. No residue obvious to the eye, but I'll have it checked, and the layout makes one thing clear. Whoever doctored the tart had access alone, or at least long enough to alter a single slice without being seen." "Then we must determine who assigned the plates," Wolfe said. "Simon claims he plated them himself. Claudia confirmed it. But if that's true, someone had to either add a poisoned garnish to just Ted's, or mark it somehow, swap it in." "Did you speak to the staff?" "I'm getting the service roster now. But here's something else. Saul's right. Ludo was being pushed into a frozen food line. Kellum was the investor behind it. The chef had motive, means, and access." "Ludo denied touching the tart," Wolfe said. "He admitted leaving the table, but not carrying anything. That may be a lie. Or misdirection. Bring me that packet. Have it tested discreetly. Then return. We must shift from speculation to pressure." I made my way back to the brownstone an hour later, the packet sealed in an envelope and handed over to a contact at the toxicology lab Wolfe trusted more than any law enforcement agency. He said results within 24 hours. Until then, we waited. Or rather, Wolfe waited. I paced. By 8 that evening, we were back in the office. Wolfe behind his desk, me on the red couch, the silence thick enough to slice with Claudia's tart slicer. He'd been chewing on the events in the same way he savored a difficult wordplay puzzle. Finally, he looked at me. "The dessert," he said slowly, "was not sabotaged." "Not in the kitchen." I sat up. "You're sure?" "Number, but I'm convinced. If it were, we would expect opportunity to narrow to two, Simon or Claudia. But consider, Claudia had no reason to kill him in that manner. Too crude, too theatrical. Simon is a coward, financially aggressive, but socially docile. Then how? It happened at the table. The question is not who prepared the slice, but who made sure Tad Kellum received that slice. That requires either sleight of hand or a subtle form of communication. A signal to whom? To someone already involved. Someone watching closely. Wait. I stood. Wolfe, Phaedra, and Paul. They're the ones who always operate in tandem. If one of them distracted the group, the other could have... Precisely. He closed. His eyes. "I believe," he said quietly, "the tart was marked in the kitchen, not poisoned. Marked. A visual cue. A piece of candied pear placed askew, perhaps, or an extra dusting of nutmeg. The person who made the mark communicated it to an accomplice at the table. That person ensured the correct plate went to Kellum, like passing the puck." "Indeed. And you think Phaedra and Paul?" "They had reason. Kellum devalued her gallery, destroyed an artist's momentum. And Paul, from what you've described, is her echo. They move as one, but even a tandem act leaves separate footprints." I sat back down. "So what now?" "Now," Wolfe said, eyes opening, "we turn the wheel. Tomorrow we invite Phaedra and Paul back. Privately. We inform them that the tart has been conclusively identified as containing a rare compound, fatal, traceable, and, most crucially, administered in a manner visible only to someone who knew what to look for. And we watch who breaks." He nodded. "Precisely. It is no longer about proving the method. It is about watching how they react to what we claim we've proven. You're going to lie. I am going to illuminate. If they are guilty, they will supply the rest." The trap, I saw, was already in motion. We weren't waiting for results. We were building a story too detailed to ignore, and daring someone to correct us. At exactly 10:59 the next morning, the doorbell rang, and I didn't need to check the peephole to know it would be Phaedra Lee. Paul King would be half a pace behind her, hands in his coat pockets, and that I'm just here to observe look on his symmetrical face. Fritz had laid out Wolfe's preferred cheese and roll tray just in case the day ran long, but I doubted he'd need it. Wolfe was hungry for something else entirely. Confirmation. I led them up, casual as you please, to the office. Wolfe hadn't shifted since 8. He'd spent the morning rereading a monograph on a hybrid orchid with the same intensity he now turned toward the pair of them. He didn't greet them. Wolfe never does when the scent of guilt's still hanging in the air. Phaedra sat with her back straight and her eyes doing laps around the room. Paul chose the corner of the couch again, angled so he could watch her face without turning his head. Wolfe didn't wait. "Miss Lee, Mr. King, thank you for your punctuality. I've asked you here under the pretext of clarification, but I will be plain. My purpose is confrontation." Phaedra's chin lifted a notch. "That's a strong word, Mr. Wolfe, especially for something still undetermined." "No longer," Wolfe replied, his voice smooth but carved in granite. "The toxicological results arrived this morning. The dessert slice consumed by Mr. Kellum contained a lethal dose of orinitine, a synthetic alkaloid compound not commercially available, but derived easily from lab-standard bitterroot extract." Paul shifted. Just once. "Orinitine," Wolfe repeated, "induces anaphylaxis masked as a cardiac event. The coroner will find it. And soon." "We did." "That doesn't prove who—" Phaedra began, but Wolfe overrode her, his voice gaining that low, resonant edge that made men confess to things they hadn't done. On the contrary, it proves intention, it proves selection, and more importantly, it proves communication. You see, the slice Kellum ate was marked. She blinked. It bore a dusting pattern inconsistent with the others, Wolfe continued. An additional touch of nutmeg arranged in a crescent along the crust, clearly intentional, barely noticeable. A visual signal. Whoever plated it meant for a co-conspirator to recognize it. Paul's jaw was tight now. Furthermore, Wolfe said, folding his hands over his belly, our review of statements places you both in direct line of observation. You had clear sight to the kitchen entrance. You remained seated throughout dessert, and neither can account for the moment Simon returned with the plates. But you could have ensured that Tad Kellum received the marked one. A word, a nod, a rearrangement of forks, perhaps. Phaedra was still. Not rigid, not collapsed, just very still. You claim coincidence, Wolfe said, but this was not spontaneous. It was prepared. The only question remaining, what did he take from you that required your retaliation to be permanent? The silence that followed was long and elegant. If guilt had weight, the brownstone would have sunk into the pavement. Then Phaedra spoke, low and clipped. He told Galleria Ottobre that Amy's paintings were derivative. He called her a talentless echo. Said they wouldn't sell. Her voice was flat, but her fingers curled tightly into the arm of the chair. She was 23. She'd had a show at the Mercy Room, one of the most promising series I've seen, and he laughed when she cried. He said the art world didn't owe her sympathy. Paul looked down at the floor. She killed herself 2 weeks later, Phaedra said. Hung herself with the cord of her own projector. I was with her, Paul said quietly. I helped hang the installation. I helped take it down after the show. I found her after. Wolfe didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. I told Tad I'd never forgive him, Phaedra said. But he smiled, as if we were having drinks. So yes. When Simon offered a reunion, I saw the opening. Her tone didn't rise, but her breath shortened. We didn't poison the tart, Paul added, too fast. We marked it. Claudia brought both, but the slices were served by Simon, who never noticed. Phaedra marked the crescent with the edge of her fork. She'd told me what to look for. I guided the plate. So who poisoned it? I asked. We don't know, Phaedra said, and this time I believed her. We assumed the mark was symbolic, Paul said. We didn't mean to kill him. It was just a warning, an old ritual. Wolfe's eyes opened wider, barely, but enough. You performed a symbolic hex, he asked, with the tone of a man who'd just bitten into a walnut and found it hollow. We're not druids, Phaedra snapped. We just wanted him to see it, to wonder if he should be afraid. That was enough, or it was supposed to be. Wolfe leaned back. Then your mark became someone else's instruction. Someone saw it, someone who had reason and substance, and used your signal as their chance. Paul's face had drained of color. You're saying... I'm saying you lit the lantern in the window, Wolfe said. But someone else opened the door. The room was very quiet. Wolfe closed his eyes, just for a moment. We're done, he said. You will leave your contact information, and you will remain available. They left without another word. No argument. No denial. When the door closed behind them, Wolfe turned to me. Mr. Goodwin, call Miss Durney. Ask her to come at once, and then call Mr. Berridge Simon. Indeed, tell him I would like to speak with him, alone. I stood. You think he saw the mark? I think, Wolfe murmured. He made the mark. Claudia arrived first. I'd barely hung up the phone when I heard her heels in the hall. Sharp, steady, expensive. She walked into Wolfe's office with her shoulders squared and her gloves clutched tight in one hand, like she was bracing for another accusation she hadn't earned. Wolfe didn't look at her. Not immediately. He was watching the light shift through the orchid leaves behind him, as though waiting for it to reveal something he'd missed. I gave her a seat and kept to the side. There was tension in the room, but it wasn't pointed at her. Not yet. "Miss Durney," Wolfe said at last, "you told me you picked up 2 identical pear tarts from Petite Flamme the morning of the dinner." "Yes," she said. "Did you inspect them?" I glanced inside the box. The tops were clean, smooth, faintly glazed, that's all. "Did you taste either one before serving?" Her brow furrowed. "Number, why would I?" "To compare," Wolfe said. "You were delivering dessert to a group that included your former fiancé and 5 others you described as difficult." She hesitated, then shook her head. "They were clean, factory perfect." Wolfe opened his eyes and met hers. One of them wasn't. That hung in the air for a moment. She didn't blink. "You think someone altered it after I delivered them?" "I know someone did. But it wasn't after. It was before plating. The tart Kellum consumed had a visible mark. Nutmeg arranged in a crescent, subtle but deliberate. We now believe that was a signal, an identifier." Claudia's mouth opened slightly, but she said nothing. "Who would recognize such a signal?" Wolfe asked. "I don't know. I don't know what it would mean." Wolfe exhaled. "Let me rephrase. Who else would know that Tad Kellum was allergic to bitterroot extract?" Claudia froze. Her lips parted, but there was no sound. I stepped in. "You didn't mention it before." She turned to me slowly. "Because I didn't think of it. It's not something he ever talked about unless we were traveling. He had a dietary list he kept in his wallet. I hadn't seen it in years. But someone at that table did," Wolfe said. "Someone who knew and who took advantage of your choice of dessert." Her eyes widened. "You think they used me?" "No," Wolfe said. "I think they used the moment. The plating was done in the kitchen by Simon Berridge, but the tarts were delivered by you, and someone had time with them before Simon ever touched them." She stood suddenly. "I need to know who." "You will," Wolfe said simply. "In due time. For now, please wait in the front room. I will call you when I have something worth saying." She stared at him for a moment longer, then turned and left the room, her heels a metronome of controlled fury. I was still watching the door when Wolfe spoke again. "Archie, has Mr. Berridge confirmed?" "He'll be here in 10. He sounded annoyed but curious, which means he's hiding something or thinks we're bluffing." "Good," Wolfe said. "Let him think both." I used the time to check in with the lab. They were still processing the powder sample, but preliminary tests pointed toward a synthetic alkaloid, possibly compounded with a dispersal agent, lethal in small doses, odorless, tasteless, indistinguishable when baked. In other words, it would pass as spice to anyone without training or suspicion. When Simon arrived, he looked more polished than the day before, but his tie knot was slightly off, and his collar was damp. Not from weather, nerves. He offered me a smile that didn't make it past his mouth. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, stepping into the office, "you've called me here without explanation. I'm assuming this isn't about a review of my duck confit." Wolfe didn't smile. "You plated the desserts the night Mr. Kellum died. 6 slices, 1 for each guest, all equal in appearance. Supposedly." Simon stiffened. "Yes, I took pride in it." "Too much pride," Wolfe murmured. "You insisted on plating yourself. You claimed it was for presentation, but was it? What are you implying?" "That you prepared those slices not to impress your guests, but to control them." Simon blinked. "Control. You ensured a particular slice went to a particular person." "I didn't," Wolfe raised a hand. "The slice that reached Mr. Kellum was marked. Nutmeg in a crescent shape. Do not insult me by denying it." Simon hesitated. "I plated them," he said finally. "But I didn't mark anything. I arranged them identically." "Then who placed the garnish?" "There was no garnish." "Then who had access?" "I don't know." Wolfe leaned forward just slightly. Mr. Berridge, when did you last speak to Kellum privately? Simon's throat moved. The morning of the dinner. What was discussed? A business opportunity, he said. He was planning to sell his shares in Lode. He wanted out. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. And you? I begged him to reconsider. He laughed. He said I'd made the restaurant a museum of flavors. He said no one wanted taste. They wanted branding. He threatened to leak our financials if I didn't agree to buy him out at a ridiculous margin. Which you couldn't afford? No. Did you believe he would? Simon looked down. Yes. Then you had motive. And you had access. I didn't kill him. Did you slice the tarts before or after speaking with Claudia in the kitchen? He blinked. Before. I had prepped them. Then Claudia came in to look. I brought the plates out shortly after. Wolfe closed his eyes. That confirms it, he said. I stepped forward. What does? Simon plated all 6 before Claudia entered. Claudia observed, but did not interfere, meaning the mark was present before anyone left the kitchen. Then who made it? Wolfe opened his eyes. Not Simon. He saw it but did not recognize it. He saw the crescent and left it in place. The person who made it? Chef Ludo March. Simon flinched. Wolfe continued. March entered the kitchen shortly before dessert. He claimed he fetched wine, but that was already at the table. He went alone. 10 seconds, he said. Time enough to dust a crescent on 1 plate. Simon's voice was low. He was near the prep counter before dinner. He said he wanted to admire the crust. He wasn't admiring it, Wolfe said. He was mocking it. He knew about Kellum's allergy, or knew someone who did. And when Phaedra marked the same slice again later, out of symbolism, March saw it and seized his moment. He carried a packet of compound powder and applied it lightly as garnish. I said it before Simon could. Using the signal as cover. Wolfe nodded. 2 marks. One intended as a message. The other, lethal. Simon slumped. You're sure? We will be, Wolfe said. Once we confront the chef? Simon looked up. You'll need help. Ludo doesn't respond well to implication. Wolfe leaned back. I don't imply, he said. I reveal. I made the call to Ludo March around 4:30 that afternoon. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice clipped, breath loud, like he'd either been mid-argument or mid-butchery. I didn't waste time trying to be polite. Chef March, Archie Goodwin, I work with Nero Wolfe. You remember him. Silence. We need you at the brownstone, I said. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Not whenever you're finished seasoning your next victim. Tonight. Why? He asked. Because, mister, Wolfe has something to say. And if you don't want it said in the presence of the police, I suggest you come hear it from him instead. There was a long pause. Then, 7 o'clock. He hung up. I gave Wolfe the update as I entered the office. He was reviewing Saul's latest notes, which included a new tidbit. Ludo had been quietly removed from an executive chef shortlist at a prestigious uptown hotel, just days before the dinner. The reason? Word had gotten out that Kellum was planning to turn Ludo's cuisine into a line of mid-shelf frozen entrees. The very idea had made some of the city's more pretentious food circles reach for their imported wine in despair. Pride, Mr. Goodwin, Wolfe said. Pride. Must as principle, the most volatile ingredient in a kitchen, especially when it goes cold. At 7 sharp, the bell rang, and I let the chef in myself. He wore black, not a smudge on him like he'd stepped out of a high-concept noir about doomed chefs and terminal secrets. His hands were in his coat pockets. His jaw was set. He didn't look at me as he passed. I followed him upstairs and held the door open as he entered Wolfe's office. Wolfe didn't rise, but his eyes lifted as Ludo took the chair we offered. Not the red one. Claudia had occupied that. Not the couch. Phaedra and Paul's domain. No. Ludo sank into the green armchair like he'd sat in it before, maybe in a different life. Wolfe waited until the silence had grown a backbone. "Mr. March," he said evenly, "you are not under arrest, but you are under scrutiny." Ludo exhaled. "Let's get to it." "Gladly," Wolfe said. "The man who died at your dinner table, Tad Kellum, was not poisoned at the caterer's, nor by the host, nor by the guest who brought dessert." Ludo said nothing. Wolfe's voice was quiet. "He was poisoned in your kitchen, after the tarts had been sliced, but before they were plated. And only one slice." Ludo's lip curled slightly. "I was out of the room." "Not long enough," Wolfe said. "You returned briefly. Claimed you were checking the wine. The wine, however, had already been opened and poured by you 10 minutes prior. So why re-enter?" "I'm a chef," he said. "I check things." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. "And you checked the tart. You admired it. You looked closely, long enough to apply something you carried with you. A fine powder, bitter root derived, tasteless, fatal to someone with the right allergy." Ludo shifted, but his eyes never left Wolfe's. "Claudia brought 2 tarts," Wolfe said. "One was consumed. The other remained. When sliced this afternoon, we found no trace of poison. The only tempered piece was the one served to Kellum." "You're guessing," Ludo said. "I'm not." Wolfe gestured, and I stepped forward, opening the envelope. Inside was the small waxy packet I'd found wedged behind the drawer liner in Lode's kitchen. "This was discovered beneath your prep station," I said. "Still faintly coated with compound traces. A dispersal powder, designed to dissolve instantly in moisture. The lab confirmed its presence in Kellum's bloodstream. Ludo didn't reach for it. He didn't move at all." Wolfe's voice lowered. "You saw the crescent on the tart, the decorative dusting of nutmeg, a signal left by someone else, a symbolic gesture, not a lethal one. But you used it, you repurposed it. You applied the compound to that same slice, knowing it would reach Kellum, that no one else would take it." Ludo's jaw flexed. "He was going to ruin you," Wolfe said. "He mocked your work. He belittled your name. He told others you were past your prime, unable to modernize. But worst of all, he intended to commercialize your identity. Frozen food bearing your name and none of your standards." Still no reply. "And when you told him no?" Wolfe asked. "I didn't get to," Ludo said finally. His voice was thick. "The offer wasn't real. It was an ultimatum. He'd already trademarked the name. My name. March signature plates." I looked at Wolfe. Wolfe's mouth was tight but not surprised. "You had motive," Wolfe said. "You had access, and you had the means." "And now?" Ludo asked. "You'll call the police." "No," Wolfe said. "You will." Ludo barked a laugh, short and joyless. "Why would I?" "Because if you don't," Wolfe said, "I will call them myself. And I will also call the city's top 4 food critics and explain in detail the length to which you went to protect your brand. There will be no court trial. There will be no public pity. There will be only infamy and emptiness." Ludo stood, not fast, just deliberately. He looked down at Wolfe with something like respect, or maybe exhaustion. "I'll make the call," he said. Then he turned to me. "You know where to find me if I don't." I nodded once. He left without another word. Wolfe didn't speak until the front door shut. Then he exhaled, slow and deep. "Fritz," he called out. Fritz entered with a small nod. "Dinner, please." "No tart." I smiled and sat back on the couch. "You were right," I said. "Of course," Wolfe muttered, "but not soon enough to prevent a death." "He'd already made his move," I said. "You just traced the knife back to the hand." Wolfe stared at the ceiling. "He used someone else's symbol as a weapon. That's the kind of crime that offends me, Archie, not only because of the death, but because it lacked even the decency of originality. I whistled low. You mean it wasn't the poison, it was the plagiarism? Wolfe closed his eyes. That, he said, and the fact that it interrupted my afternoon beer. I didn't argue. After all, justice had been served, just not with dessert. Dinner that night was veal scallopine with morels and a side of buttered fava beans. Fritz served it, precisely at 8, which was half an hour later than usual, but not a record. Wolfe had insisted on finishing a brief statement for Inspector Kramer, written in his fastidiously correct curt prose, and by the time we sat down, the veal was exactly at that temperature Fritz likes to call still breathing, but resigned. Wolfe was quiet through the first half of the meal, which meant his mind hadn't yet released its hold on the case. He forked his food with that automatic precision that says he isn't really tasting it, and his eyes kept drifting toward the far corner of the dining room, where the late afternoon sun had cast long shadows through the lace curtains. I didn't interrupt, but by the time he'd finished his second glass of beer and Fritz brought the lemon tart, safely made in-house, thank you, I figured I'd earned the right to needle him. So, I said, another narrow escape from dinner party diplomacy. Think Kramer will take it personally we scooped him again? He will be irritated, Wolfe said, dabbing his mouth with a napkin, but not surprised. His sense of pride is regional, not personal. He's not going to like that March hasn't been booked yet. Wolfe exhaled through his nose. March will report himself within 12 hours. He's vain, not foolish, and he understands the value of choosing one's moment of disgrace. He'll bring a lawyer. He'll cry exhaustion, perhaps even remorse. I leaned back. What I don't get is how he knew Kellum had the allergy. It wasn't common knowledge. It wasn't, Wolfe agreed. But Claudia knew, and Kellum was careless with details. Vanity, again. He likely bragged at some point that he could eat anything but bitter root. He said it at a party, I recalled suddenly. 2 years ago, you weren't there. He joked about being allergic to self-reflection and bitter root while making a toast. Wolfe's eyes met mine. And who else was at that party, I thought. Phaedra? Claudia? Ludo? March was catering the hors d'oeuvres. Wolfe nodded once. That was the first exposure, he remembered. It lingered, dormant until the moment presented itself. I whistled softly. Talk about a long shelf life. Indeed. We finished dessert in silence, and when I helped Fritz clear the plates, Wolfe retreated to the office. By the time I followed, he was back in his chair, the statement for Kramer folded neatly beside him, his gaze drifting toward the far bookcase like it had just told him a secret he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. Archie, he said as I sat, do you know what disturbed me most? I tilted my head. Besides the tart? He didn't rise to the bait. Number 8 was not the death, nor the deceit, nor even the appropriation of someone else's symbolic gesture. It was the ease with which they all adapted afterward. Each one, Claudia, Phaedra, Paul, even Simon, treated the aftermath as manageable, negotiable. That's modern living, I said. You can survive anything if you post about it the right way. He ignored that. We invited 6 people into this house who each had reason to want Kellum silenced. We revealed the crime, reconstructed the method, and offered the killer a single off-ramp from ruin. And he took it. And you think that was too easy? I think, Wolfe said, that guilt is no longer a deterrent. It is only a delay. That one made me pause. I'll note that for your memoir, I said, under the chapter called Wolfe Forgets How Humans Work. He almost smiled, but before he could deliver a retort, the phone rang. I answered. Goodwin. The voice on the other end was low, breathy, almost a whisper. Tell Mr. Wolfe I made the call. They're expecting me in the morning. It was March. And? I asked. I left something in your alley, in a paper bag. I didn't know what else to do with it. What is it? A pause. What I didn't use. He hung up. I looked at Wolfe. He left the rest, in our alley. Wolfe groaned. Fritz will have a conniption. I grabbed my coat and flashlight. It was nearly 10, and the alley behind the brownstone was never a place I enjoyed after dark. But I found the paper bag wedged behind the empty crates, like it had crept there out of shame. I brought it inside, handled it with gloves, and laid it on Wolfe's desk. Inside was a small glass vial, half full with a fine, dull powder. No label, no markings. Wolfe stared at it without touching it. He kept it, I said. As a backup? As a monument, Wolfe muttered. His insurance, or perhaps his power. We sealed it and called the lab. The final loose thread was tied. But Wolfe didn't return to his book. He didn't sip his beer. He simply sat there, quiet and wide-eyed, as though the real mystery had only just begun. Why so many people, handed the ingredients for a peaceful evening, had instead chosen a recipe for destruction? I let the silence sit between us. Somehow, it felt earned and heavy, like a final course that no one had the appetite for. Wolfe didn't speak again that night. Not a word. He sat in his chair while I filed the last of the statements, and while Fritz tiptoed in with chamomile tea, quiet as a ghost with perfect posture. Wolfe remained as still as the orchids around him, the flickering lamplight glinting off the untouched vial we'd sealed and labeled in my blocky handwriting. Ornithine residue. Unused. He didn't touch it. He didn't look away from it either. When I finally left him there and turned out the lights behind me, I had the oddest feeling, like closing a door on a room that wasn't quite empty, even when no one was in it. I slept lightly that night, and I'd bet a round of drinks I wasn't the only one. Morning in the brownstone was routine in shape, if not in tone. Fritz had brewed coffee strong enough to bruise, and I took mine with toast and a side of contemplation. Wolfe didn't emerge until nearly 10, which was later than usual even by his sedentary standards, and when he did, his expression wasn't so much weary as thickened, like a man who'd sat too long with his own thoughts and found them sour. I was halfway through the Gazette when the front bell rang. Wolfe had only just settled into the office, so I handled it. It was Claudia. No appointment, no call. Just her in the foyer, trench coat open over a pale blue dress, hair pinned with the kind of efficiency that says I've got something to say, and you're going to hear it. She didn't wait for me to ask. I need 5 minutes with Mr. Wolfe. Did he invite you? Number, but I think he wants to hear this. I let her in. She stood before Wolfe's desk like she was meeting a judge, and to be fair, she kind of was. Wolfe gestured her into the red chair without speaking. That alone told me he wasn't entirely caught off guard. I heard about Ludo, she said. Wolfe gave the smallest nod. I wanted to say thank you. You saved me from becoming part of it, from being used again. You are not part of it, Wolfe said, though you were its unknowing delivery mechanism. She inhaled. Still, I'd like to do something with that knowledge. Something useful. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. Such as? I want to speak to the press, she said. Not to clear my name. I don't need that, but to expose what happened and the way he turned a private symbol into a tool for murder. People should know how easily even a gesture can be stolen. Wolfe's lips pressed together in a tight line. And what do you expect will come of that? She shrugged. Maybe nothing. But maybe? Someone like Tad won't get to pretend that behavior like his doesn't have consequences. And maybe Ludo won't be remembered as a brilliant chef who fell from grace, but as a man who picked up someone else's metaphor and used it to commit a crime. Wolfe was silent for a long moment. Then, you have a curious sense of justice. I've had to, she said. All women do. That settled in the room like a small storm. Wolfe inclined his head. Do what you must, but speak to Mr. Goodwin first. He'll help you frame the truth without feeding the vultures. She turned to me with something like gratitude, maybe even respect, and I stood to walk her out. She stopped in the hall, near the rack where her coat waited. "There's one thing I still don't understand," she said. "Try me. Was Ludo planning it before the dinner, or was it truly opportunistic?" I thought about that, about the powder in the vial, carefully portioned, tucked into a wax packet and hidden, about the powder March hadn't used, what he left in our alley like a confession in a lunch sack. "He didn't know when," I said, "but he was ready. All he needed was a moment, a signal, something that said now." She nodded. "Phaedra gave him that." Unwittingly. But she still gave it. I didn't answer. She left without needing one. Back in the office, Wolfe had resumed his vigil with the vial. It sat just out of reach, like something he wanted to remember without owning. "I assume she's made peace," he said. "She wants to tell the truth." "She wants catharsis," Wolfe muttered. "A salve. But the truth doesn't soothe. It rubs." I walked to the desk and sat. "You're unusually philosophical this morning." "It's the tart," he said dryly. "Ruined me for sweets." We didn't laugh, but the silence softened. That's how it always is with Wolfe. No triumph, no chest beating, just the return of quiet after a storm. And yet something still bothered me. "You were right about the symbol," I said. "The nutmeg crescent, but you never said how you knew it wasn't Phaedra's idea to kill him. Not fully." He looked at me then, and his voice, when it came, was quiet. "Because she never blinked," he said. "When I told her the tart was poisoned, she didn't react with guilt or fear, only confusion and then anger. Genuine anger. She thought her metaphor had been twisted. Not discovered. Which it had. Precisely. A lie can replicate guilt, but only betrayal produces that particular kind of fury." I nodded slowly. "That's what tipped it for you?" "No," he said. "That's what confirmed it." We sat a while longer, the case complete in every official sense. March would confess, and Phaedra would retreat, and Claudia would write something angry and articulate. Maybe people would read it. Maybe it would vanish into the wind. But somewhere beneath it all, Wolfe and I both understood the truth. There had been 6 people at that dinner. All of them brought something to the table, but only one brought death. And the rest? The rest brought the weather, the clouds that made it possible, the cover, the crowd. You can't serve poison without a table. And that night every seat had been set. The following week unfolded the way a body cools, gradually without ceremony, but never without weight. Ludo March turned himself in at the appointed hour, flanked by counsel and wearing a look that had already rehearsed regret for the cameras. Kramer called us 3 times that day, not out of professional necessity, but because, I suspect, he wanted to chew Wolfe out and knew he'd be given nothing but verbal air to bite into. I took his calls and played buffer while Wolfe remained cocooned in his books, rising only for meals and his afternoon orchid ritual. It was as if, once the storm had passed, he was content to let the wreckage settle without comment. But the city didn't let go as easily. By Thursday, Claudia's op-ed had been published. The marked slice, how symbol became weapon at a table for 7. It wasn't flowery, but it was precise, measured, clear-eyed, and laced with that quiet indignation that has more power than any screed. She didn't name names, but she named intentions. She wrote about how control can wear a smile, how cruelty can pose as commerce, and how silence around the table doesn't mean no one's holding a knife. It went semi-viral, which, in her circle, meant it was read over brunch in art lofts and high-end kitchens alike. Wolfe read it once and said nothing. I read it 3 times and thought a lot, especially about the line near the end. There's no such thing as an innocent guest when the menu includes vengeance, which for someone not trained in detection was a damn fine deduction. Saul came by Friday with follow-up from the DA's office. March had confessed, as expected, but insisted he'd only acted impulsively, spurred by humiliation. They'd found more orinotine residue in his apartment, though Wolfe noted dryly that if March were as precise with flavor as he'd been with toxins, he might have kept his culinary career from becoming an obituary. After Saul left, we settled into that brief pocket of stillness that follows every closed case. A time when Fritz rotates to comfort food, Wolfe retreats into Montenegrin poetry or obscure orchid treaties, and I catch up on paperwork that could just as easily have been ignored a week longer. But this time, it didn't hold. Saturday evening brought one final ripple. The bell rang just past 6. I was in the front room, sipping coffee and debating whether to head out for a movie that didn't involve betrayal or poison, when I opened the door to find Simon Berridge on the stoop. He looked rested but thinner, like a man who had fasted on guilt and found it filling in a different way. "I won't stay long," he said, "but I thought Mr. Wolfe might want to know something." Wolfe, upon hearing his name, allowed Simon into the office with only a grunted assent. He didn't stand, didn't blink, but I noticed his hands, resting on the chair arms, tightened slightly. Simon stayed standing. "You were right," he said, "about the plating." I didn't see the mark consciously, but afterward I remembered thinking the dusting was uneven, that it had a bend to it, a kind of curve, and I still served it. "You served all of them," Wolfe said. "But yes." I didn't ask. I didn't question. "No," Wolfe said again. "You didn't." Simon's voice dropped. I think I wanted him to suffer, even if I didn't know how. Wolfe was silent. "I'm not proud of it, but I thought you should know." "You told the police?" "No," Simon said. "They're interested in motive, not degrees of passivity." Wolfe gave the smallest of shrugs. "That's what makes them ill-suited for questions of ethics." Simon turned to go. Wolfe stopped him with a word. "Mr. Berridge." Simon paused. "You did not kill him," Wolfe said, "but you made no attempt to stop it." Simon waited, still facing the door. "You will carry that," Wolfe finished. Simon nodded once, then left. I waited until the door shut before I said anything. "That was almost generous," I told Wolfe. "Almost." "He wanted judgment," Wolfe replied. "He needed it spoken aloud." "You gave it to him." "I gave him the truth. The judgment is his own." He didn't speak again for a while. The evening settled deep into the corners of the brownstone. The last of the light edged through the high windows, turning gold into gray. I sat by the bookshelf, not reading, not writing, just thinking. There are endings that come with fanfare, with flashing lights and signed statements and clean resolutions. This wasn't one of those. This was the other kind, the kind that leaves a residue. Wolfe reached for the vial, not to open it, just to place it into a drawer beside him, slow and final. "That was the last of it," he said. I nodded. "The case?" "Number the noise." And with that, he closed the drawer, picked up his beer, and sipped. The silence returned, and this time it stayed. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the brownstone, casting long, lazy shadows that seemed almost reluctant to move. Wolfe sat immobile in his chair, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the lace curtains, though I doubted he saw much of the cityscape. I, on the other hand, was pacing, the ritual nervousness of a man about to witness the final act. All the players were here. Claudia Durney, her composure tighter than a violin string. Simon Berridge, whose polished veneer barely concealed the crack running through it. Phaedra Lee and Paul King, the art dealer and her partner, each exuding their own carefully calibrated air of innocence and accusation. And of course, Ludo March, the chef who'd cooked up more than just meals. They sat like reluctant jury members, eyes flicking toward Wolfe's impassive form as though he might reveal his verdict by mere glance. Wolfe cleared his throat, a small, deliberate sound that instantly commanded the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth but absolute, "we are gathered not simply to revisit a death, but to dissect the anatomy of intention." He paused, allowing the weight of that to settle. Tad Kellum died after consuming a slice of dessert. The slice was not merely food. It was a message, marked with a crescent of nutmeg, an identifier placed with purpose. He turned slowly toward Claudia. "Miss Durney, you delivered those tarts, unaware of the deadly modification that awaited one particular slice." Her eyes did not waver. "To you, this was a jest, a gesture between former lovers, a nostalgic provocation." She swallowed, but said nothing. "Mr. Berridge, you plated the slices, claiming no knowledge of the mark's significance. Yet you noticed the subtle curve, the irregular dusting." Simon's face tightened. "You served the slices nonetheless." He nodded, silent. "To Mr. March," Wolfe continued, "you applied the toxin orinotine, an invisible assassin nestled in powdered form upon the marked slice." Ludo's jaw clenched, but his gaze did not falter. "Messrs. King and Miss Lee, you conspired to convey a symbolic message, your own brand of justice through metaphor, unaware that your signal would become the trigger for murder." Phaedra's fingers clenched the armrest. Paul's eyes darkened. Mr. Kellum was many things: venal, cruel, manipulative. But his fate was sealed not just by those he wronged, but by the intricate dance of deceit at this table. Wolfe leaned forward. This was not a crime of passion, but of calculated opportunity. Each participant complicit, some knowingly, others unwittingly. He let that sit before delivering the final blow. Justice, however, demands clarity. Mr. March has confessed and will face the law accordingly. Others must reckon with their roles, not just in this event, but in the lives they choose to shape around them. He rose, towering despite his sedentary nature, and fixed them each with a gaze sharp as a knife's edge. "The brownstone has been disturbed, the sanctity of its stillness broken by human frailty and ambition. But truth, like dessert, must be served, if not sweet, then at least honest." The room exhaled as one. The tension ebbed into resignation and, perhaps, a grudging acceptance. As they filed out, Wolfe turned to me, a flicker of something almost resembling satisfaction in his eyes. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "the game is concluded. The pieces return to their boxes. The board may yet be reset." I nodded, feeling the familiar pull of a case closed, yet never truly finished. Dinner awaited. Trout a mandine. No tart. And as Wolfe settled back, humming softly to himself, I couldn't help but think that, in his world, justice is a meal best served carefully, and sometimes after dessert.